The clinic lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant, the kind that stays in the back of your throat. I handed my appointment slip to the young receptionist and waited while she tapped something on her screen. Her eyes paused, then flicked upward with a nervous twitch I almost missed. A low breath slipped out of her before she leaned closer and whispered, "Your son asked us not to call you back." For a moment, I didn't move. Her words sat between us like something dropped on the floor, too awkward for either of us to pick up. I could feel the older man in the next chair glance over, curious about my sudden stillness. My hand hung in the air, longer than it should have, unsure whether to pull back or reach forward. A warmth crept up the side of my neck, a quiet embarrassment I didn't want anyone to see. She straightened quickly, forcing a polite smile that didn't match the tension in her shoulders. The keyboard clicks behind her slowed as another staff member turned slightly in our direction, pretending to organize papers. I kept my voice steady as I asked if I should wait somewhere else, but she only nodded toward the chairs without meeting my eyes. Something in her hesitation felt rehearsed, like she had been warned to expect me. I sat down, trying to steady my breathing while a cold draft from the hallway brushed across my ankles. My tests were supposed to be routine, just yearly checks a man in his late 60s has to do. Nothing about them should have involved my son. Yet the whisper replayed itself in my head, each repetition twisting the meaning tighter. It was the kind of sentence that carried more weight than the tone used to deliver it. A nurse pushed a cart past me and gave a small, sympathetic smile, the kind people use when they don't want to get involved. I felt every unfamiliar glance land on me as if they all shared a piece of information I wasn't allowed to have. The lights seemed brighter than usual, sharp against the sterile walls, and every sound felt louder than the last. I sat with my hands clasped tighter than necessary, trying to make sense of a situation I hadn't known existed. When my name was finally called, I stood with a stiffness that surprised me. The doctor barely looked up from her clipboard as she handed over the sealed report, her tone short and professional. She didn't ask how I was feeling, nor did she offer the usual explanation of what the tests were for. The envelope felt heavier than papers should, as if the results carried more than medical information. Walking toward the exit, I caught the receptionist watching me again. The moment our eyes met, she quickly turned away, suddenly absorbed in the phone beside her. Her reaction confirmed what I had felt from the start. Whatever was happening, it wasn't an error or misunderstanding. Something deliberate had been put in motion, and I was the last person to know about it. Outside, the afternoon air hit my face with a coolness that did nothing to clear my thoughts. I stood near the parking lot, watching people move around me with ease, unaware of the unease spreading through my chest. Being a widower had taught me to handle quiet moments. But this silence felt different, sharper, more pointed. It carried an edge I couldn't ignore. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket and tightened the zipper. The weight of it seemed to pull me slightly forward as I walked to my car, each step marked by a dull ache in my knees. I didn't look back at the clinic windows, though I could feel the pressure of unseen eyes lingering there. Whatever was hidden inside that building was tied to someone I had trusted all my life. The engine turned over with a steady rumble, but the sound didn't ease the knot forming in my stomach. I rested my hand on the steering wheel, letting a long breath settle in my chest before pulling out of the lot. The day had begun normally enough, but the whisper from that young woman had changed its shape entirely. I drove away with the quiet realization that something had shifted in my world, and it wasn't going to shift back. I didn't open the envelope when I got home. I set it on the kitchen table beside the fruit bowl, and let it sit there while I filled the kettle. The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that reminds you how long it's been since someone else's voice filled the rooms. I leaned on the counter and watched the steam rise, thinking about the boy I once carried on my shoulders through the same doorway I had just walked through alone. Raising him after his mother died had been the hardest and simplest task of my life. Hard because grief makes every routine feel like lifting a weight. Simple because loving him gave shape to my days when I had nothing else to hold on to. I taught him how to tie his shoes, how to ride a bike, how to stand up straight in front of people who didn't care whether he did or not. Back then, he would stay close to me, asking questions about the world like it was all one big puzzle, and I was supposed to solve it for him. The distance didn't arrive suddenly. It crept in through small moments, missed calls that stretched into days, visits shortened by tight schedules, rushed dinners where he checked his phone more than he looked at me. I tried not to read into it, Children grow up. Their lives fill with responsibilities, ambitions, people who take up space you used to occupy. I told myself that was normal, even when it stung more than I admitted. I noticed the shift more sharply a few months ago when he came by with a stack of envelopes in his hand. He was unusually serious, though he tried to hide it behind a tone that felt practiced. He said he had been helping organize Dad's papers, as if I had asked him to. He moved through my desk drawers like a man searching for something, or removing something. When I questioned what he was doing, he gave a quick laugh and brushed it off, claiming he wanted to make things easier for me. The way he said it didn't sit right, but I let it pass. Then he mentioned her, the new girlfriend. He spoke of her lightly at first, but there was an undercurrent there, like she had been in his ear about decisions he wasn't ready to make on his own. I saw her once, briefly, when she waited in the car while he stopped by. She looked at me through the windshield with a kind of distant curiosity, the way someone studies a house they're thinking of buying. I told myself I was imagining it. The kettle clicked off, breaking the stillness. I poured the water and sat at the table, staring at the untouched envelope. I had trusted him completely once. It wasn't a blind trust. It was earned through years of leaning on each other more than anyone else. But something had shifted in him, and that shift had turned into a space I couldn't reach into anymore. I felt it every time he rushed through a conversation, every time he said he'd call later and didn't. A wave of loneliness settled over the kitchen, not the dramatic kind, just a quiet heaviness that pressed down on my shoulders. The walls held faint reminders of a life I once shared with his mother, echoes of a home that had more laughter in it than silence. I rubbed my thumb along the edge of the table and forced myself to stay present, not drift backward where old memories could pull me too far. Another moment resurfaced, clearer now than when it happened. He had brought a set of forms one evening, telling me they were health documents for emergencies. He said it casually, almost too casually, pushing a pen toward me as if signatures were routine. I told him I wanted to read them first, and he withdrew the papers with a quick nod, promising we'd go over them later. We never did. He avoided the topic afterward, as though it had already been settled. The envelope on the table felt heavier the longer I looked at it. Whatever was inside, whatever he had blocked the clinic from telling me, sat between us now, like a wall I hadn't realized he was building. I reached for it slowly, feeling the careful weight of every unanswered question, and opened it with the quiet understanding that something in my life had shifted long before today. I opened the envelope carefully, sliding the papers out with the same caution a man uses when he's not sure what he's about to see. The report felt thinner than it should have, and the staple marks on the top suggested pages had once been attached and were no longer there. I laid the papers flat on the table, scanning the headings and charts, trying to understand whether anything serious was hidden behind the missing sections. Nothing in the results explained why someone would keep them from me, and the quiet absence of information felt more troubling than any diagnosis. My phone buzzed on the counter. A notification lit the screen. Unsuccessful login attempt to your bank account. I stared at it longer than necessary, unsure whether it was a common scam alert or something I should take seriously. Still, the timing sent a small ripple down my spine. I opened the banking app, went through the security questions, and saw everything looked normal. But the thought lingered, the kind that doesn't make noise, but refuses to leave. I dialed my son, trying to keep my voice steady. When he answered, it was with the hurried tone of someone walking through a parking lot. He said he was busy with something important and could talk later. I asked if he knew anything about the clinic call settings, but he cut me off with a short laugh, saying he didn't handle any of that. He promised he'd call back, though we both knew he wouldn't. The line went quiet a moment later, leaving the conversation unfinished and the tension still hanging in the air. I returned to the papers on the table. A small line near the bottom of the first page caught my eye. Authorized contact updated per request. The date beside it was recent, too recent. I didn't remember signing anything or agreeing to any change. My mind moved slowly through the possibilities, ruling them out one by one. The clinic wouldn't alter something that important without documentation. That meant someone had provided it. Someone who had access to information only I should have had. I flipped through the remaining sheets again, looking for a signature page or consent form, but nothing was there. It felt like reading a book with chapters ripped out, the gaps doing more harm than the words that remained. A cold heaviness settled into my palms as I folded the papers. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces weren't lining up the way they should have. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to take out the trash. My neighbor, an older man who spent most of his afternoons trimming the small hedges near his gate, called out a greeting. We exchanged the usual pleasantries before he paused and mentioned seeing my son earlier in the week. He said my son had taken some envelopes from my porch, assuming he was helping out. I didn't respond right away. I simply nodded and said I appreciated the mention. Inside, a quiet discomfort spread through me like slow-moving water. I went back inside and stood in the hallway, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. Each detail from the day perched in my mind. Missing pages, the login alert, the hurried phone call, the updated contact line, and now the mail being taken without my knowledge. None of it screamed danger on its own. Each piece was small and almost dismissible, but they formed a pattern that didn't sit right, a pattern that suggested decisions were happening around me rather than with me. I set the papers inside a drawer, placing my keys on top of them, as if that would somehow keep them anchored. The house felt different now, not unsafe, but unfamiliar, like someone had shifted the furniture just enough for me to notice. I took a seat at the edge of the couch, letting the quiet press in. Whatever was unfolding, it wasn't a single mistake, and it wasn't accidental. It was the beginning of something I could no longer ignore. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with the blinds half open, letting in just enough light to read the clinic's phone number. My hands felt steady, but my stomach didn't. I dialed and waited through the automated prompts until a staff member finally answered. I kept my voice calm as I asked for a copy of my full record history, including any changes to my contact information. There was a long pause, too long for a routine request. I heard papers shifting, a muffled exchange in the background. Then the staff member returned with a strained politeness. She said certain documents had already been signed on my behalf. The phrasing struck me harder than the words themselves. I asked when that happened. She hesitated again, giving a date I didn't recognize, one I knew I hadn't been anywhere near their building. Something cold settled in my chest. She offered to print what they could release and said I could pick it up later. Her tone suggested she wished the conversation ended sooner. When the call disconnected, I set the phone down slowly, watching my reflection in the stainless steel kettle, as if the answer might be hidden there instead. I walked to my bedroom and opened the desk drawer where I kept personal documents, old insurance forms, tax papers, my passport, and the folder with medical records. The drawer slid open with a familiar wooden creak, but the inside looked wrong. Several folders were shifted to the side, and the envelope that usually held signed documents was thinner than I remembered. I lifted it carefully and felt the hollow space where thicker papers had been. A quiet unease pushed its way up my spine. Someone had gone through them. I emptied the drawer onto the bed and sifted through everything piece by piece. Near the bottom of the stack, stuck between two older files, I found photocopies of my signature. At first glance, they seemed normal, but the more I looked at them, the more the edges didn't line up. The slant of the last letter was off. The pressure marks were uneven. They looked like imitations, close enough to fool someone who wasn't paying attention, but unmistakably wrong to me. The realization settled with a weight I didn't have words for. I sat back and took a long breath, feeling the room grow smaller around me. My son had asked me months ago about emergency documents, and I had told him I'd look them over first. I hadn't signed anything afterward. Yet here were copies, altered, tucked away in a place he knew I rarely checked. I didn't want to believe it, but the drawer didn't lie. I moved to the living room and opened my email on the old laptop I kept on the side table. The inbox loaded slowly, the screen taking its time to reveal what I wasn't sure I wanted to see. Near the top was a thread I didn't recognize. Messages from the clinic. I clicked through them one at a time. The earliest message confirmed a simple appointment reminder. The next few showed adjustments to their notification system. Then I found it. A message stating the clinic had updated primary contact per request and would direct all updates to him only. His name stood there plainly, in black text, arranged in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. My jaw tightened. The words didn't need interpretation. No one had stolen my identity. No outsider had manipulated my records. The person who made the request was someone the clinic trusted because he was already listed as my son. He had positioned himself where no one would question his intentions, not even me. I closed the laptop and let my hands rest on the table. The pattern was no longer scattered pieces. I could see the outline now. Missing pages, changed contexts, altered signatures. It wasn't clumsiness or confusion. It wasn't miscommunication. It was deliberate. And whoever started it wasn't finished. The bill arrived in a stark white envelope with the hospital's logo stamped across the top. I opened it while standing near the kitchen counter, expecting a routine fee for the tests I actually remembered taking. Instead, the numbers on the page were far higher than anything I'd agreed to. Several procedures were listed that I had never scheduled, and one line item carried the phrase "special evaluation," something I had no memory of consenting to. The room felt colder as I reread the statement, each line pressing deeper into the hollow beneath my ribs. Before I could process it further, I heard footsteps on the porch, quick and too familiar. My son knocked once and pushed the door open, as if the gesture was a courtesy rather than a request. He walked in with a forced ease, glancing around the room with an alertness that made the air tighten. I didn't greet him right away. He spotted the hospital bill in my hand and reached for it casually, though the speed of his movement said something different. I pulled it slightly away, enough for him to hesitate before masking it with a tight smile. He asked if everything was fine, but his tone carried more impatience than concern. When I told him I had just received the bill, he stepped closer, insisting he should look at it so he could handle things. There was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before. Defensive, irritated, almost cornered. It was the kind of reaction that didn't belong to a man trying to help, but one trying to stop something from being seen. I told him I could read it myself. His jaw tightened for a moment, then shifted into a hollow grin. He asked where my test results were, trying to sound casual, but his gaze moved across the room like he was searching for them. The urgency beneath his questions was hard to miss. I placed the bill on the counter, watching the line of his shoulders stiffen. He didn't ask how I was feeling or whether the tests had worried me. He only asked where the papers were. I went to the desk drawer, opened it slowly, and pulled out the file containing the altered signature copies. His eyes flicked to the folder with a quickness he didn't bother to hide. Inside, on top of the stack, was a form I hadn't noticed earlier, a pre-filled document labeled Medical Capacity Evaluation. It had my name printed neatly, my birth date, and a section describing why a declaration of incompetency might be necessary. The signature at the bottom, meant to imitate mine, sat crooked on the page like a quiet insult. I didn't show it to him. I held it long enough for him to see the corner of the document peeking out. His expression shifted, a flash of irritation, followed by a strained attempt at calm. He stepped back, rubbing the side of his temple, muttering something about confusion and paperwork mix-ups. His words felt thin, stretched, and shaped to cover a truth he wasn't prepared to articulate. As he paced toward the hallway, his phone buzzed. He answered it without stepping outside. I heard the muffled voice of his girlfriend through the line, her tone sharp and hurried. One sentence reached me clearly. "Did you get the papers? We need to figure out what happens with his assets." My son stepped farther away, lowering his voice, but the damage was done. The words sat heavily in the space between us. He returned a moment later, trying to appear composed, but the tension in his posture betrayed him. He didn't reach for the documents again. He didn't mention the call. He simply said he had somewhere to be and would check in later. His departure was abrupt, the door closing behind him with a finality that left the air unsettled. I stood in the center of the living room, the forged form still in my hand, feeling the slow, creeping realization settle over me. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a series of mistakes. I wasn't imagining the pattern. I was being cornered, quietly, methodically, and by someone I had once trusted without question. I carried the folder of papers into the attorney's office with a grip tighter than I intended. The lobby was quiet, lined with framed certificates and brochures about senior rights. I sat in a chair that sank slightly under my weight, feeling the unease settle deeper as I waited. When the attorney finally called my name, he greeted me with a calm professionalism that felt both reassuring and unsettling. I followed him into a small room where the blinds were partially drawn, leaving the light edged and muted. He asked what brought me in. I placed the folder on his desk and slid it toward him without speaking. He opened it carefully, lifting each page with the precision of a man accustomed to seeing what others overlook. He examined the forms, the forged signatures, the altered documents, and the medical authorization sheet. His expression shifted in small, controlled movements. Nothing dramatic, but enough for me to understand the situation was worse than I had guessed. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady, almost too steady. He said the signatures were tampered with, and the pattern suggested intentional manipulation. He explained that these kinds of documents, medical capacity evaluations, updated contact authorizations, were often the first steps someone used to take control over an elder's medical decisions. The ease with which he said it sent a cold sensation through my chest, as if the words were stripping away any remaining doubt I had tried to hold on to. He tapped the form that carried my forged signature. "This wasn't done by mistake," he said. "It's part of a process. Once someone establishes medical authority, financial access usually follows. It's a coordinated tactic." His tone never left its professional calm, but the weight of his explanation pressed heavily into the room. He paused and looked directly at me, as if making sure I heard the next sentence clearly. "They're preparing to take over your decisions." The air felt thinner after he said it. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but a tightening sensation pulled across my chest with every slow inhale. He went on, explaining how the pattern fit a common sequence. First, altering contact information, then initiating evaluations, then attempting to assume control over financial or legal matters. None of it sounded hypothetical. It sounded like he was reading directly from the week I had just lived. He advised me to secure every document I owned: birth certificate, will, banking information, medical files, identification, anything that could be copied or used without my knowledge. He recommended keeping them off-site or in a place where no one else had access. His tone stayed clinical, but each instruction landed with a sharp clarity that left no room to misunderstand the gravity of what he was saying. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual with my finances. I mentioned the login attempt from the bank. He leaned back slightly, as though the missing piece had clicked into place. He said attempts like that often came after medical control was forged, because once someone could claim diminished capacity, they could justify taking over accounts for protection. Hearing it laid out, that plainly made the room feel smaller. He told me this was the point where I had to act, not wait. There was no immediate danger in the dramatic sense, but legally and medically, the window to protect myself was narrowing. He didn't offer comfort, and I didn't expect any. What he offered was clarity, cold, procedural, and unmistakably final. When I left his office, the hallway felt longer than before. My footsteps echoed with a quiet certainty I hadn't felt until now. The situation was no longer confusing or fragmented. The pieces had formed a single, chilling line. There was no misunderstanding, no miscommunication, no harmless oversight. Someone I trusted had begun a process meant to remove my voice from my own life, and I had just reached the point where turning back was no longer possible. The first thing I did after leaving the attorney's office was drive straight to the bank. I walked in with a steady posture, though my insides felt anything but steady. The manager recognized me from years of quiet visits and listened carefully when I asked to update my security settings. I didn't mention specifics. I didn't need to. He helped me set new passwords, added extra verification layers, and removed any secondary access. When I reached into my coat pocket, I felt the edge of my identification documents, tucked inside a sealed envelope the attorney had urged me to keep close. For the first time in a long while, I was aware of how much someone could take with a single signature. At home, I locked my ID, passport, and will inside an old metal box I hadn't used in years. The weight of the box felt heavier than the items inside it, as if it carried a quiet warning. As I set it in the back of my closet, my phone buzzed twice, my son calling. When I hesitated to answer, he called again. I finally picked up. Keeping my voice calm, he didn't bother with greetings. He wanted updates. He wanted to know what the clinic had told me, what the attorney had said, what documents I had looked at. His tone held a sharp impatience, a barely contained irritation that made the air tighten around me. I told him I had things under control. He didn't like that. He pressed harder, asking why I had gone behind his back, as if my own life required his permission. The defensiveness in his voice wasn't normal concern. It carried an edge, something frantic, something threatened. By the time the call ended, the line between us felt thinner and more strained than ever. 2 days later, he showed up with his girlfriend. She stayed near the doorway, arms folded, looking around the house as though she were taking inventory. She asked, with a sweetness that didn't match her expression, whether I had considered getting the power of attorney paperwork settled. She said it as if it were a simple household task I had been avoiding. My son watched me closely, waiting for my reaction. I kept my face still, my voice steady, and told them I was handling my own documents. Their disappointment slipped through the cracks of their polite smiles. After they left, I placed my phone on the dining table and played back the recording I had made during the conversation. The words were clear enough. Her suggestion, his quiet agreement, their shared push toward decisions they had no right to control. I saved the file, labeling it without emotion. It felt strange to record my own son, but strangeness had become a familiar part of my days. Later that night, I opened my laptop again, the room lit only by the small lamp on the corner table. Inbox held several messages that looked ordinary at first, but one thread caught my attention. Emails between my son and his girlfriend. They weren't meant for me, but a fragment had been forwarded accidentally through an old shared document app we used during tax season. The subject line read, "Assets Timeline." I clicked it, feeling the chill reach past my ribs. The message was blunt. They discussed dates, access, the sequence of steps, and what they expected to gain once everything was finalized. My name appeared only twice, both times in the context of paperwork. Reading their words felt like lifting a stone to find something unpleasant crawling beneath it. I sat for a long time after the screen dimmed, the weight of betrayal settling slowly in my chest. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, a question pressed itself forward. Where had I failed as a father? I didn't let the question linger too long. Self-blame wouldn't help me now, but it left a bruise, one I felt deeper than anything the forged papers had done. I closed the laptop, straightened my posture, and let the silence gather around me. The time for confusion was gone. Whatever came next, I needed to be steady, deliberate, and prepared. When the moment arrived, I would face him, without anger, without theatrics, but with the truth set plainly between us. A line had been drawn, and I was ready to stand on mine. I called my son in the late afternoon and told him I needed his help with something at the house. I kept my tone even, giving no hint of what waited on the dining table. He agreed too quickly, as if eager to regain control of whatever he thought he had lost. When I hung up, I arranged the documents in a clean line, the medical forms, the altered signatures, the contact update notices, each one a quiet marker of how far this had gone. The house felt still, almost expectant. When he walked in, he tried to act casual, but his eyes moved around the room with a flicker of caution. I gestured for him to sit. He hesitated before taking the chair opposite mine. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. Then I slid the first paper toward him, the medical evaluation form with the forged signature. His expression tightened instantly. He reached for it with a jerky motion, as if snatching it could undo the fact that I had already seen everything. He started talking fast, stumbling through explanations that didn't match his earlier confidence. He said he didn't know how the form was created. Then he said the clinic must have mixed up something. Then he tried blaming a clerical error. Each excuse contradicted the last, and he could hear it too. Desperation seeped into his voice, thin at first, then sharper around the edges. When that didn't work, he shifted the blame to his girlfriend. He said she misunderstood things, pushed him into helping me, and handled paperwork without him knowing. His words came out in uneven breath. He kept running his hand through his hair, a nervous habit from childhood that now looked foreign on a grown man. The denial wasn't about innocence. It was about being caught. Before I could respond, the front door opened without knocking. His girlfriend stepped inside with a speed that suggested she had been waiting nearby. She entered the dining room, her expression tight and defensive. She glanced at the documents spread across the table and immediately adopted a tone of wounded indignation. She said there had been confusion, that they were only trying to make things easier, and that I was overreacting to simple mistakes. Then she placed a new set of papers in front of me, power of attorney forms. She spoke with a forced calm, explaining how this would avoid future complications. My son stayed silent, watching me carefully, hoping I would be overwhelmed enough to comply. Their voices overlapped, each trying to persuade, pressure, corner. The room felt smaller with every sentence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse them. Instead, I reached for my phone, tapped the screen, and played the recording. Their own words filled the space. The talk about assets, the timeline, the plan. Their faces froze. My son's girlfriend's mouth tightened as the recording continued. He shifted back in his chair, unable to look at me, unable to look away from the truth laid out between us. When the audio ended, I told them I had spoken with an attorney. I said it plainly, without heat. The silence that followed was thick and immediate. My son's eyes flicked to the documents, then to me, then to the floor. The last layer of his performance slipped. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confident push he'd been using to guide me where he wanted. His girlfriend started to speak again, but he cut her off with a quiet shake of his head. He realized then that every step, every forged signature, every attempt to steer my decisions had been exposed. There was no angle left to hide behind, no explanation that could undo what I had already seen. He stood slowly, as if the act required effort. There was no apology, no anger, no attempt to reclaim authority, just a silent acknowledgement that the line he had crossed was one he couldn't step back from. The tension in the room didn't break. It simply settled into a heavy, undeniable truth. I didn't tell him to leave. He walked out anyway. The next morning, I drove to the attorney's office with the folder of documents sitting on the passenger seat like a weight I couldn't shift. He greeted me with the same calm professionalism as before, but this time there was no uncertainty in the way he handled the papers. He reviewed each form again, taking notes, marking dates, and arranging everything into a sequence that showed intent as plainly as a map. When he finished, he said he would file formal complaints for attempted elder exploitation. His voice carried no judgment, only a steady understanding of what needed to be done. He asked me to recount the details one more time for accuracy. I spoke slowly, giving each moment the clarity it deserved. When I finished, he typed the final lines into the report and submitted the paperwork through a secure system. It was strangely quiet afterward, the only sound being the soft hum of his computer. He told me the process would move forward quickly. I nodded, feeling both protected and hollow. Later that week, 2 officers came to my home to take my statement. They were respectful, patient men who listened without rushing me. I handed them the recordings, the forged forms, and the emails discussing the assets timeline. They documented everything and asked a few follow-up questions, forming a timeline that matched the attorney's assessment. When they left, they said someone would contact my son and his girlfriend to take their statement as well. I didn't ask when. The next day, I received a call from the bank's fraud department. The representative confirmed there had been multiple login attempts tied to my account. They weren't guesses. They were targeted tries using partial information from my profile. They froze the access logs, secured everything behind new layers of authentication, and assured me the attempts had been documented for the legal case. Hearing it said aloud stripped away any remaining hope that this had been a misunderstanding. Later that afternoon, I sat across from the attorney again as he processed the paperwork needed to remove my son from any medical or financial authority. It was a simple procedure, but the emotional weight behind it made the room feel heavier. With a few signatures and notarized pages, the authority he had once held by trust was gone. It was a step I never imagined taking in my lifetime. He then walked me through updating my will, adjusting protections, and securing future decision-making rights, with layers no one could bypass. I followed each instruction carefully, signing where needed, reading every line twice. The office light reflected off the polished table as I pressed my pen to the final page. It was not a moment of victory, just a necessary act of survival. Driving home afterward, the sun had begun to set, leaving a muted orange hanging low across the sky. The road looked familiar, the same route I had taken for years, but it felt different now. I rested one hand on the steering wheel, feeling the dull ache in my fingers, the kind that comes from holding tension too long. There was relief in the knowledge that the danger had been addressed. The system had stepped in, and the path ahead was safer. But beneath that relief was a heaviness I couldn't shake. This wasn't a stranger or a distant acquaintance facing consequences. It was my son, my only child, the person I had once carried into this world and walked beside through every hardship. Knowing he had chosen this path didn't soften the blow, it made it sharper. The betrayal didn't disappear just because the paperwork was filed. It lingered like a bruise beneath the skin. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had faded into dusk. I sat there for a moment before turning off the engine, letting the quiet settle around me. The house waited in its stillness, unchanged and patient. I stepped out of the car with a mixture of relief and heartbreak balanced in my chest, knowing the next chapter of my life would be different. Safer, yes, but marked by a line I never wanted to draw. In the quiet days that followed, I found myself moving through the house with a different kind of awareness. Betrayal doesn't arrive loudly. It grows in familiar corners, in the comfortable silences we stop questioning, in the trust we offer without imagining it could be used against us. I saw it clearly now, how small moments had built a path I didn't notice until it was too late, not because I was old, but because I believed the bond between parent and child was unshakable. That belief had kept me blind long after the warning signs began. Age hadn't made me vulnerable. Trust had. The kind forged through decades of shared meals, long car rides, school recitals, and hospital waiting rooms. It was trust that allowed me to hand over spare keys, to leave documents in unlocked drawers, to assume that every question he asked came from care, not calculation. The realization stung, but it also sharpened something inside me. A clarity I hadn't carried in years. I understood now that protection wasn't paranoia, it was responsibility. Some nights I would sit at the table where everything had unfolded, the forged papers, the recording, the confrontation, and think of how easily things could have gone another way. I didn't want bitterness to take root. I didn't want to carry anger like a stone in my chest. So instead, I focused on what I could control. I organized every document I owned, placing them in secure folders with clear labels. I locked what needed locking and shredded what no one should ever have. I set alerts, limits, verifications, layers of defenses I should have established long ago. I began telling myself the advice I wished someone had told me earlier. Question sudden offers of help, read every paper twice, and keep control of your own information. Independence isn't something you lose in one moment. It's taken subtly, piece by piece, until you look up and realize someone else is steering your life. I wasn't going to let that happen again, not while I had breath, strength, and a clear mind. As the days passed, I rebuilt my routine. I cooked breakfast at the same small stove my wife once used, letting the familiar motion steady me. I fixed the hinge on the back gate, swept the porch, trimmed the small tree by the fence. Activities I had once taken for granted now felt like claims of ownership over my own life. Each task reminded me of who I was before fear crept in. An older man, yes, but still capable, still aware, still standing. When I finally returned to the clinic for a follow-up visit, I walked through the lobby with a calm I hadn't felt in months. The receptionist looked up with a softer expression this time, and there was no hesitation in her tone when she greeted me. I updated my contact information myself and signed the necessary forms with steady hands. As I sat in the waiting area, I felt a quiet peace settle around me. I wasn't here because someone else arranged it. I wasn't being guided, influenced, or monitored. I had come on my own terms. Driving home afterward, I glanced at the passenger seat where the folder of secured documents usually lay. I thought of my wife, of the life we built, the home we protected, the child we raised. All of it still stood because I had taken back what mattered. Whatever my son chose to become, it was his path, not mine. My duty now was to safeguard what remained and honor the years that had shaped me. As I pulled into my driveway, a steady truth settled in my chest. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't heavy. It was simply clear. The world may change, and people may change with it, but the responsibility to guard one's life never fades. Growing old isn't the danger. Trusting the wrong person is.